Hello and welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast. This is episode 232, the genesis of gender.
Are you sure? You were like a little question marky about that.
I just, the words are small, so it's like a genesis, no, the genesis.
The words are small, but the heart is big. Yes, welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast, where we talk about how the gospel is good news for everyone every day. I'm your host, Laurie Krieg, and alongside me is my husband and favorite licensed therapist, Matt Krieg. Matt, how are you?
Hi, I'm tired.
Why are you tired today?
Well, I mean, yesterday, first one in, last one out was...
Oh, at work.
Yeah, working from basically 8 in the morning till 10:30 at night. So
you are amazing.
Some would call that like not healthy boundaried. But
I feel like a mental health therapist could come alongside right now. And
do
say,
we have another
hey,
one?
Matt.
Is there another one that I can talk to right now? I don't know.
I don't have one, but I do have the most professional radio voice among us. Do you have some advice for Matt? Steve Odell?
Suck it up. No. Not
Stop
that.
it.
Not that.
Nice.
Hi, guys.
Well, I'm glad you both are here. And today on the podcast, I'm so excited. I just said that before we hit record about this conversation, because we're going to be talking with the author of one of my favorite books of the year, The Genesis of Gender. Her name, the author, is Abigail Favale. And I heard her speak at Exiles in Babylon in April, where I also spoke. And after hearing her speak, I was like, I need this book. And I would love to talk to this person after reading it. And I shared it with many friends. But Steve, help our audience get to know her a little more than my exuberance.
All right. Abigail Favale is a writer and professor in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. Her best-selling book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, has been translated into 7 languages. A new edition of her conversion memoir, Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversion, was just released by Ignatius Press. Abigail lives in South Bend, Indiana, with her husband and 4 children.
Well, before we officially welcome her, I do want to remind you of today's sponsor, O'Neill Asset Management. The team there, when we said to ourselves, who are we going to call? After we called the Ghostbusters, we called the team at O'Neill Asset Management, who helped us to think about things like retirement and how to plan for our financial future. If you have similar questions, not about ghost busting, but about your finances, you can reach out to o'neillassetmanagement.com. There is a link in the bio. But officially, now is the time. Abigail, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We're so glad you're here.
So
your turn.
We typically try and get to know our guest in a little bit more frivolous way. And so the question of the week for this week that we're going to throw your direction, we also have some Facebook answers for you, is what is the best pickle? And if pickles are not the best for you, do you have a fun way to say that they're not the best?
Well, I mean, it is funny that you're asking about pickles because I happen to be pregnant at the moment.
Oh, congrats.
So there's one answer. However, I don't actually like pickles, whether I'm pregnant or not. I do, however, like relish.
Oh.
So I like pickle relish on a hot dog.
At
or in
Costco?
salad.
Do you like
What?
the Costco relish on those?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Equal opportunity relish preferences. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. Matt, what about you?
Okay, so I too am someone who is not a fan of pickles, and Laurie posed the challenge of, if you don't like pickles, you have to write a haiku about your disdain for pickles. And so here is my haiku.
Oh my gosh, you did this.
Sour, dimpled, gross. Leave the cuke, give me the brine for a marinade.
Wow.
There you go.
There you go.
Well done.
Beautiful.
Well
Amen.
done.
Yes, and so the person that I resonated with on Facebook was Melinda, who just said pickled okra, because I think my problem is the cucumber itself. It's not actually the pickling process, because that is very versatile and useful.
I liked this from Lisa on Facebook, which if you guys want to respond to the question of the week, you guys were funny. Honorable mention to Sarah, who said the real pickle was the friends we made along the way. And always the shout out to, who is it here? Danny Everett, telling us a joke about when you got in a pickle while playing sports. Anyway, Lisa said Milwaukee midgets. You can buy them at Meijer. They're so crispy, yum. Actually, I just bought them at Meijer. And if you're from West Michigan, you say Meijer, Milwaukee midgets. So you're welcome for that little ear stab.
I feel like it's important to establish that this all came up because it's Christmas time.
Yeah.
And there's a tradition of hiding a pickle in the Christmas tree.
Yeah, this is why. We're relevant. We don't just randomly talk about pickles.
It's not just random. It's Christmas.
What did you like?
I really liked what Karen had to say.
The best pickle I have ever had was from Walensky's Light Lunch in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Walensky's is a kosher-style lunch counter that was opened in 1932, and ever since then they've had a limited menu of sandwiches and the best sour pickles that I have ever had.
Okay. So I got to go to Montreal now and go to Walensky's.
I love all the passionate pickle talk.
I like the deli pickle, and so I've got to try that.
Abigail, we talk about how the gospel is good news for everyone every day. And so we love asking guests this same question and hearing their heart. You're having a re-release of your memoir. So this may be very applicable. So if part of the gospel is we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe, yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. How is that gospel first good news for you, and how is it still?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, it's probably the hardest one you'll ask me today to give a succinct answer, which is why I'm like, I'll write a book in response to a question, right? But in some ways, I have two conversions. I first accepted Jesus when I was 3, and I don't actually remember this. So it was a kind of a received story. So I grew up with no memory of prior to Christ. But then I kind of went away from the faith later after college, and then returned to faith about 10 years ago, around the age of 30. And so I do have more of a memory from that conversion. And it's interesting in your question how you've connected both an awareness of our own sinfulness and brokenness with the good news of the gospel, right? Because those two things are connected. And I think part of my deconversion was rejecting a sense of my own sinfulness and brokenness, kind of getting rid of the idea of sin and wanting more of a kind of high five affirming kind of faith where everything I did was awesome, which is great for a while. But then if you alienate yourself from the reality of sin, you also alienate yourself from the reality of grace. And so my adult reversion, I guess you could say, back to the faith was very much characterized by an encounter with both of those realities. And I think of the scripture in Luke 5, I believe it is, where we see Peter's conversion, right? Where Christ has an invitation to them to press out into deep water, let down their nets for a catch. And then, of course, they just have this abundant harvest, right? So there's this gift of abundance that Christ gives us. But then Peter's response to that isn't just awesome, but actually he falls on his knees like, and he's aware of his own poverty, in the presence of that abundance. And so I find that to be a kind of beautiful expression of the experience of conversion, which is just the abundant encounter of God's grace, but also the kind of harder self-knowledge that comes with that, but that's a part of that, right? And so I really liked the question, how you connected those two things, because I lost sight of both of them at once and then rediscovered them together.
Wow. Well, and to give credit where credit is due, I just hijacked it from Tim Keller. So
good on Tim.
As one does. So Abigail, we're wanting to talk with you about gender. And in your book, you really start in Genesis, and you say that, sexual difference is not an extraneous or faulty feature of the cosmos, but an essential part of its goodness. Can you dive in a little deeper into that this was a created, God-ordained good thing?
So one of the problems I think we have with Genesis is a problem of familiarity. The story is so familiar that we've lost sense of actually how radical it is. So if you look at other ancient creation narratives, ancient cosmologies, you'll see that sexual difference is either not mentioned at all, right? So it's not even important enough to worth mention. Or if it is mentioned, it's often mentioned as something gone wrong in the cosmos, right? So one example that I talk about is the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, which begins with this kind of epic battle between this male god and this kind of primordial feminine goddess who must be like conquered and murdered before the world can be created. And he actually makes the world out of her corpse. So it presents this idea of conflict and enmity between the sexes. And then in that story, when humans are created, sexual difference isn't mentioned at all. If you look at one of Plato's creation narratives, he describes women as, the first generation of human beings are all male, and then the bad men are reborn as women, right? So and there are other examples, but often what you'll see is that sexual difference is either not worth mentioning or it's actually presented as a flaw. But what you'll see when you read both creation accounts in Genesis that tell kind of the same narrative of creation, but from two vantage points, is that the culmination, the climactic moment of both narratives is not just the creation of human beings, but also the sexual differentiation of human beings. And that's particularly true in the second narrative, where the whole narrative kind of builds up to the creation of woman. So there's a sense that that first human, when he's alone, when there's no sexual differentiation yet, it's an incompletion, right? Something's not quite right. God's not quite done, right? But then in that wonderful moment when you have sexual difference enter the scene, then the first words recorded in scripture spoken by a human being are a song. It's this, he breaks out into song about, at last, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. So even in just kind of a narrative or literary sense, that whole story is building up to that moment, which is presented as the culmination of God's creative work. And of course, that is in place before the fall. So it gets twisted in the fall, but it's not a cause of the fall, but it's presented as something deeply good and part of God's design.
So when people talk about gender, sex, bodies, they tend to kind of separate them all from each other as if we're like parts of a whole instead of a whole being. How do you look at bodies, sex, and gender in that wholeness?
I really love this question because I think you're pointing out something really important about the rhetoric people use to talk about sex and gender in our time. And so I'm hoping that people who haven't noticed this will now be able to notice it. So in our time, sexual difference is often talked about as if it's kind of this disparate menu of traits, right? That, might come in a different, it's almost like a pick and mix kind of, you might get this assemblage of traits or this assemblage. But that rhetoric overlooks the fact that those traits come in two very distinct packages, right? Arrangements, 99.982% of the time. So very consistent. Okay. So it's like talking about stars, but forgetting that there's actually a constellation that those stars come in. And so I think in your question is the answer, which is to think about sex in terms of wholeness, in terms of the whole organism, and not kind of breaking out each distinct traits as if there isn't an organizing principle that brings them together into two distinct sexes.
How do you see people break it apart? Like, where do you see it? You said you see that people do this. Where do you see it?
So when we kind of talk about the debates and confusion about gender in our time, the different theories that are on offer, I would say there are two main theories. One would be that gender is a social construct, right? And the other would be more of a subjectivist understanding of gender, that gender is really an innate sense of self, okay? And there are meaningful differences between those two theories, but what they both have in common is displacing gender from the body. And so I think then the tactic tends to be, in order to support the gender theories on offer, you have to destabilize or dismantle the reality or people's kind of faith in the reality of the sex binary. And so that's most often done by talking about sex as if, well, there isn't really a discrete binary, but sex is complicated, right? You have genetic sex, you have hormonal sex, you have chromosomal sex, you have secondary sex characteristics, you have genitalia, you have reproductive organs. So it's not just one thing. Again, so kind of speaking about this, it's all these sorts of an array of things. And then just stopping there, right? Again, not actually, naming the fact that those tend to come in two distinct arrangements, that is a very consistent, and upon which our species depends upon those two arrangements, right? That are both oriented toward a certain role in reproduction. So that tends to be the tactic of activists, is to kind of present sex as this complicated, hard to discern, just kind of constellation of different traits, right? That we really have a hard time understanding. And I think that is a misrepresentation.
I want to jump to the question that you were going to ask. Yeah.
Well, and I think this was helpful. Like when you define woman, you say it's the kind of human being whose body is organized around the potential to gestate new life. How did you come to like that as a definition? In face of that or in light of that, like how would you define man? Like what? Can you unpack some of that process, I guess? Sure.
I'll start with that second question first, which is I would define man in a similar way, which is the kind of human being whose body is organized according to the potential to generate outside of himself. Or you could say insemination too, in contrast with gestation. And I wish I could take credit for coming up with this myself, but I have to say I cribbed Aristotle on this one. So these are pretty much the definitions that Aristotle gives in his philosophy, and I think they still hold true. But what was really helpful for me, that I think is a really helpful philosophical distinction, is the word potential.
Right.
So organized around the potential. So this is a distinction between potentiality and actuality. So a potential is something that exists whether or not it is fully actualized. So as a female, my body is organized according to the potential for motherhood. Now, I happened to mention earlier in this podcast that I have actualized that potential, right? But nonetheless, when I was a little girl, prepubescent, even though I couldn't actualize my potential for motherhood, it nonetheless still existed, in the sense that my whole bodily structure was organized around that potential. And even after menopause, I will still have that potential, even though it can no longer be actualized. And this, I think one of the hesitations in defining men and women according to reproduction is, a very reasonable objection. Like, what about infertile men and women? Does that mean there's somehow less of a man, less of a woman? And this concept of potentiality really solves that objection, because infertility, by definition, is referring to an innate potential that is prevented from being actualized, right? So a woman who can't get pregnant experiences infertility, whereas a man who can't get pregnant, right, we wouldn't say he's infertile. Like if he goes to the doctor and says, "Doc, I'm trying real hard, but I'm not getting pregnant," the doctor wouldn't say, "Well, you must be infertile," right? Because he doesn't have that potential to begin with. So the very category of infertility actually signals the fact that we have an underlying potential that is part of our nature as men and women. And I think men and women fundamentally, even though we can't reduce it to reproduction, men and women name fundamentally what is a reproductive category. That's what sex is fundamentally.
So literally, I quoted you this morning to my 5 and 8 and 10-year-old. They didn't know it. But I said, I don't know. We're talking about gender, as we do in our family. And I said, can girls ever become boys? And they're like, no. I said, why? And then they'll say, like, they're starting to get the language because we bring these things up all the time. And I said, girls can never, or boys can never have babies. And then I quoted your, if you could talk a little bit about it, you talked about Ignar Victor, right? The first transsexual. He tried to completely transition and he died from it. I literally told my kids this morning. Wow. And they were like, what? I said, yes, because they were like, why? I was like, male bodies are not ever made to do what female bodies are meant to do. So having that definition for people who are like, okay, well, whatever, how does that apply? It is invaluable to me as a mom and as a teacher in this space, because it's so simple when people are like, well, a man can be a woman because he likes heels. And you're like, meh. So can you talk a little bit maybe about Ignar Victor, or like a little bit more in this space, how it helps you to maybe even talk with your kids or those you teach?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I have these conversations with my kids, which I also have, because kids will sometimes have ideas about boys and girls being, about extraneous things in a way, like, the kind of toys you play with or the colors you like, right? Which I think in a way is reflective of how our culture now thinks about gender as something more performative or artificial and not thinking about it in terms of the body. And so with my kids, I'm always like redirecting things back to the body. We're like, no, like yeah, boys can play with those toys. That's fine. They're still boys because of the kinds of bodies they are, right? And so, with my kids, I'll use the language like, you have a body where you could grow up and be a daddy one day, and to my daughter, you have a body where you could grow up and be a mommy one day, right? So just redirecting like the body as the ground of sexual difference, and that it's not actually about the sort of stereotypes, which is ironically how our culture has tended to define this, right? Where, if a boy likes to play with dolls, maybe he's not really a boy, right? So I'm trying to kind of cultivate in my kids this deep awareness of the body as being the ground of being a girl or being a boy.
It's huge. Okay, huge light bulb went off for me when you connected the current transgender ideology that is, you feel this, let's transition you like a autopilot, and birth control. It just made so much sense. I articulated it to some of my friends medium well. Can you articulate it a little better?
Sure. I love that you like this, part, because when I wrote it, I was like, and this is where I put my crazy Catholic hat on.
Yeah. Well, I'm one of 12 kids, so I don't know.
Yeah. No, but it's true. I mean, I think there is an important conversation happening in Protestant circles around this too, which I think is fantastic. So the book, I mean, in a sense, the book traces, the development of gender, or the genesis of gender, in terms of two revolutions, you might say. And one of them is the conceptual or philosophical revolution. And that's part of what we've been talking about, the kind of shift in understanding what we even think gender is. And the other piece of that is a technological revolution. And those two things they're intertwined, they unfold simultaneously. So one of the interesting things I found out while researching this book that I didn't know going into it was that the hormonal technology to masculinize a female body or feminize a male body was developed at the same time, and it's kind of part of the same process of developing the hormonal birth control pill. So that happened in the same decade with the same new technologies of being able to manipulate healthy endocrine systems in order to produce certain effects. So that's one way in which they're connected, because hormonal birth control functions by hormonal interventions that actually cause the female body to malfunction, right, to not function well, in order to produce a certain effect, in this case, to prevent pregnancy. And similarly, hormonal interventions, when it comes to people who transition, they disrupt the normal endocrine system of the individual in order to produce an intended effect. And this would be kind of masculinizing or feminizing or changing secondary sex characteristics. And another way in which these phenomena are linked, I think, is that when our society became a contraceptive culture, where contraception became the norm, I think that had a profound effect on you might call it our kind of cultural imagination, how we think about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. I think it shifted us into more of a kind of sterile imagination, where we no longer think about men and women primarily as naming procreative potential. But instead, we kind of have this default assumption of assumed sterility, or, maybe you can flip the switch and then like procreate, but it's no longer seen as like kind of an essential or fundamental part of our nature. And so I think that shift is part of why it now seems plausible for someone to change sex, because we no longer think in terms of reproductive potential. Because it is more plausible for someone to dress, if being a woman is really about what you wear, or about having breasts, or it's about looking like a woman, it's about appearance, right? Then it becomes more possible or plausible for someone to be able to change sex. And so I think contraception was part of that revolution in shifting how we think about men and women, not in terms of bodily reproductive realities, but in terms of what we look like, what roles we play in society, things which can be manipulated in a way that reproductive potential can't.
It's what's interesting to me is, okay, I'm just going to say, I'm going to speak on behalf of Laurie Krieg right here, is there never a time for contraceptive? Is there never a time for any of these things? No, I'm not going to say that. But it is very interesting, Abigail, as I have been touting some of what you have said, and then just trying to help parents understand God's design for life, marriage, and sex. And God's desire he wants us to be a reproductive people, not because he's like a right-wing conservative who just wants 1,000 kids in the world. It's because he wants his image everywhere. He wants people to see images of his love everywhere. And so what I say in response to this is for parents who, after I speak, I'm like giving arguments for God's design for marriage. And I have to bring up sex. And people are coming up to me, couples who are like, well, I don't want to have kids. And I was like, I'm not going to pat you on the head and say that's wonderful. I'm going to ask you to ask the Lord, because he's about his image everywhere. He's not a hyper fundamentalist. He's God. Anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox. Steve, do you have more to say? Or Abigail, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question to have. And even the question of like whether Christians or anyone should use contraception or not is in some ways like a separate question from how has the widespread embrace of contraception shaped our culture and how we think about men and women, right?
Yes.
Which I think it has profoundly. But what you were saying about God's design, and this was something that was a big change when I became Catholic, but it really was having to face the fact that when God designed the pleasure and the unifying power of sex to be inseparable from its procreative power.
Yeah.
And what does it mean if I want to disentangle those things which God has connected for my own kinds of goals or preferences, And I will just put in a plug here for there are amazing fertility awareness methods of family planning. So that I have found very effective and that work with a normal female body without disrupting it. So again, I agree with you. I'm not, even though I personally don't use contraception and am theologically opposed to it. There are ways of being prudent and discerning in planning one's family, right? So this isn't, kind of a push for having as many babies as possible, right? Which would not necessarily be God's plan for a family either.
But it's like, are we even asking the question anymore?
Right.
That's where I want to push. And if we're not, why aren't we? And look at what it's fostered as far as defining male and female. And then 2, let's go back to Genesis and what's the purpose of life, marriage, singleness, sex. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. How about you, Steve?
Well, okay. So apparently there are people who have kind of changed their ideology around gender because they read about intersex people and they say, oh, look, God is creative with gender. And what do you think about the intersex question?
Yeah, this I think is a really important question because if I had to pinpoint one kind of argument that causes the most confusion about the reality of sexual difference, it would be the way intersex conditions are talked about. I call it kind of the intersex gambit or the intersex trump card, And there's a lot of misinformation about what intersex is even referring to. So intersex is a term that what it's really referring to is a range of over a dozen different conditions, congenital conditions that somehow affect the sexual reproductive system. So like any system in the body can be kind of affected in its normal development, the sexual reproductive system, that can happen as well. So the way intersex is often talked about, however, is as if there's a third sex or some kind of sex that is not that totally outside the sex binary, or that sex is just an open-ended continuum or a spectrum. But that actually misrepresents what we're talking about. So a better term is actually disorders of sexual development, and that's the more common term used in the medical world. And the vast majority of intersex conditions do not actually result in sexual ambiguity, but there might be some kind of atypical variation in a male body or a female body. So intersex conditions are actually best understood as variations within maleness and femaleness rather than exemptions from the binary. And in fact, many DSDs are sex specific. So, only males get Klinefelter syndrome, or only females get Turner's syndrome. So I think it's much better to actually not really use the term intersex, but to talk about DSDs, or what's best actually is to have, condition-specific terminology, because there's actually a wide range of differences between the various DSDs and what they can result in. So, but when we talk about intersex conditions, again, I said the vast majority don't result in sexual ambiguity. So the most complex are also the most rare. And so those conditions that could result in some kind of apparent sexual ambiguity, either at birth or maybe during puberty in the sexual development process, those types of really rare intersex conditions account for only 0.012% of births, right? So to flip the statistic, in 99.982% of births, there is no sexual ambiguity. And so the sex binary is actually incredibly stable. I'm actually surprised at that statistic, considering how complex the sexual development process is and how many chances there are for things to go a little awry. But I also think it's dehumanizing to people who have DSDs to talk about them as if they're this kind of magical unicorn sort of human that's neither male or female,
right?
Because that's really just not accurate. These are men and women. These are males and females. They just have a condition that causes some kind of disruption in the sexual development process. And so they deserve support, medical support, psychological support. They don't deserve to be used as a tool to kind of make way for validating any claims to a sex or gender identity.
Didn't you have listed, you said sometimes numbers, these intersex kind of air quotes around them numbers, include things like PCOS?
Yeah, right.
Like
so
I know 10 people with PCOS.
Yeah, right. So there's the most oft quoted misleading statistic about intersex conditions is that 1.7% of people are intersex.
Yeah.
So you might hear the argument like as many people are intersex as have red hair. Right. This is not true. So that 1.7 stat comes from the work of a biologist named Anne Fausto Sterling, who I began studying, I studied her work in graduate school 20 years ago, right? So she's a biologist who's very much informed by postmodern gender theory. And so her stat comes from a definition. This is like a literal quote where she says, anyone who doesn't fit the platonic ideal of male or female. What? And so that would include any kinds of variations. Would include, say, like someone with PCOS who has really high testosterone, but still within the female range, right? So when you actually kind of control for conditions, again, which do really result in some kind of sexual ambiguity, that statistic drops to, 0.018%. So it's much, much lower. So so that is a bad stat. If you hear it, it's based on a wildly expansive, let's say, definition of what qualifies as intersex, which would include many males and females who do not have sexual ambiguity and who are completely fertile.
I get asked a lot. I'm sure you're asked too. And essentially your book is the thesis is the answer to this. But what is your hypothesis on one stat? That there was a 2,300% increase of teens in the UK seeking sex change between 2010 to 2020, the majority of whom are female teens, whereas 20 years before, it was almost a 0% number. Do you have some theories on that?
Yeah, so it's important to realize that not only is there an increase, but there's significant demographic shifts. So prior to, let's say, 2010, most people who experienced gender distress or who sought out transition were adult males. And so now most of the people who seek out transition, and this really started to shift starting kind of in 2011, 2012, but really upticking in around 2014 and on, are not males but females, and not adult, but either young adult or even adolescent females. So the age shifted down and the sex ratio flipped and then escalated. Just exponential escalation. It's really remarkable to look at some of these stats in terms of escalation. So I think it's a complex phenomenon. I don't think you can point to it's caused by this one thing. After all, adolescent females, they're intense, let's say, and they tend to, when they experience distress, it tends to be dramatic and self-inflicted, right? So there have been various waves you can look at, or you might say kind of social contagions within adolescent females. I think when I was growing up, it was much more about anorexia and bulimia. It was much more about eating disorders. In the early 2000s, there was kind of a self-harm epidemic, right? And so in some ways, this is the newest iteration of that phenomena. It's a way of young women kind of expressing distress in a kind of self-directed and self-inflicted way. But I think there's more to it than just that. Why is it now directed at gender? I think the internet has a lot to do with it. One thing I noticed in my book, every single person I interviewed, and I interviewed a lot of people with a lot of different experiences, the internet was somehow part of their story about how they eventually adopted a kind of either cross-gender identity or began to experience gender dysphoria. So I think there's something about the phenomenon of the internet, both in terms of that's where you kind of encounter these sorts of ideas, but also the internet is a kind of disembodied reality, right? How do we exist on the internet? We have to curate this ideal self, right? Who can be actually radically different from who we are in real life. And so I think in some ways what we're seeing is an attempt to kind of bring the liquidity of the internet avatar into the real world, right? So there's kind of this detachment or alienation from the embodied physical world. I think social media and kind of influencers is a big part of what's driving it. I think another kind of common theme I heard in stories that I listened to from young women is being exposed to violent pornography at a young age and seeing that as sort of a picture of what it means to be a woman in our culture. Mm-hmm. And it's very understandable, I think, why a young woman or a young girl who's just starting puberty would want to run from that image of what it means to be a woman and want to rebel against that, kind of rightly so. Mm-hmm. And I think puberty is a tough time. It's not fun. Nobody's like, wow, I wish I could go back and relive puberty. That would be a real good time. And so I think a lot of these phenomena are kind of feeding into, and of course, another piece is the fact that there has arisen this whole narrative and industry, right? Which of course drives demand, right? A profit-driven industry, which now has a narrative that if you experience this, I have a solution, and it is lifelong medicalization, which happens to make me a lot of money. Exactly. Right. And so that's something that's very different from the earlier kinds of social contagion epidemics that I mentioned, because there was never a time when the medical establishment said the cure for anorexia is liposuction, or to affirm these young women's views of themselves and to facilitate kind of long-term and invasive treatments that medicalize the body unnecessarily. So that is a huge, huge difference. Right, that now we have adults in authority telling these distressed young women that you are right about how you feel about your body, and let me help you radically change it. Mm-hmm.
Well, and so that's it. It sucks. I'm just gonna say that it puts a lot of ire in my eyes, I guess, at least toward the medical community, that these systems that are supposed to be there for the health of the holistic person, mind and body, have kind of bifurcated and separated mind and body and said, okay, well, we're going to fix your mind. We're going to completely deconstruct and rebuild your body, which is also when you say like the internet being this disembodied kind of experience, that's what's being told there is like your mind is the only thing that's important. Your body is not even a part of the equation. And so when a doctor or the medical community or anyone comes to a kid or a parent who maybe loves their kid and is like, well, the only answer here, if you don't, is to transition. Because if you don't transition, they will kill themselves. I guess what is the other option? How do we work with people in a way that isn't, saving the mind by tearing apart the created body?
Right. Well, I think the first step is to say that narrative that if you don't transition, you'll kill yourself is a lie. It's a lie, and it's not supported by evidence. In fact, the Supreme Court case, the kind of gender medicine case that's in the Supreme Court, there were just hearings on it earlier, I think it was last week, the Skermeti case, the lawyer for the ACLU was asked by one of the justices, is there actually evidence that there's a higher risk of suicide? And then the ACLU lawyer responded, thankfully, suicide is admittedly vanishingly rare. So basically admitting that this whole narrative isn't true, and then kind of switching to suicidality, which of course is more like suicidal ideation, which of course is still a problem and something we should be concerned about, but very distinct from completed suicides, right? An actual kind of suicide risk. So there's not evidence to support that narrative. In fact, there's some evidence that points toward suicidality actually worsening because of transition. So it's a much more complicated narrative. So I would say, for one thing, like, we need to really push back against that narrative because it's emotional manipulation that's not based in fact. And even the activist side is admitting this at this point, at least in front of the Supreme Court. But as to other solutions, I guess one thing to realize is that we also have to resist the allure of the quick fix. When it comes to our woundedness, when it comes to kind of our deep kind of psychological wounds, these things don't always have quick, easy resolutions, right? And I think our culture is very much one that wants those. We want the quick fix. We want the fast food. And so the gender-affirming medical model presents itself as the quick fix. Of course, it's neither quick nor a fix. But it's concrete. It's something, it's like I now have a very concrete step-by-step process that I can follow that will speak to this misery that I'm undergoing. That is like a very compelling narrative, right? So I have nothing but compassion for people who go down this road to try to manage their suffering, right? And I think I have less compassion for the people in authority who should know better, right? Who are kind of driving the narrative and making money off of it, right? And I think in general, I think it's actually very hard to generalize about this experience because I think it gathers up all kinds of different experiences and wounds. For some, gender dysphoria might be rooted in an experience of trauma. For some, it might be, something that happened very early in childhood and has always been a part of their experience. For others, it might be more of a desire to fit in, to kind of go with the trend, do something cool, right? So I think you have to, when we're talking about actually how to walk with someone in this experience, you really have to kind of discern what's going on in the heart and experience of this particular individual. But I would say in general, I think that real gender dysphoria, not just identity experimentation, but real gender dysphoria, I think, is a response to some kind of underlying wound. And so the healing process is part of trying to discern what's really going on. And I think therapy is kind of a mixed bag. There are bad therapists out there, so you got to be careful with this. But I think good therapists who are willing to walk with and explore kind of what might be underlying some of this distress, and then working through identifying and healing some of those underlying wounds. It's not a quick fix, but it is a better path to healing than medicalizing the body unnecessarily.
So you've kind of spoken to this a little bit, but I am imagining, our listeners and viewers who maybe are struggling in some way with their gendered self, whether it is a dysphoria or just kind of like an unrest in their bodies. In the time we have left, could you just share a word of hope for somebody who might be there as we're having this conversation right now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations, especially with Christians who have this experience. I'm working on a project right now which involves interviewing a lot of Christians who have this experience. And again, there's so much variation. Like, it's really hard to generalize. But at the same time, it's been so wonderful to hear how Christians have navigated this experience in a way that actually has brought them closer to Christ and has brought real fruit in their lives. So I think there's also like another piece of the puzzle to pull on as Christians is we need a better theology of suffering in a way, and I'm thinking about even what it says in Colossians about, uniting our sufferings to Christ. There's a way in which Christ leaves his own suffering open in a way that we can participate in and unite our sufferings to him. And I'm not saying this as like, oh, you should just suffer, right? Of course, like I mentioned earlier, I think there are paths to integration. Like I've talked to people who have walked those paths and are living a more integrated whole life where they've kind of reconciled themselves with their bodies. So I do want to say that word of hope, but I also want to say it's not a quick fix, right? And so in the midst of that suffering, I guess through prayer, really inviting Christ into it. Like, how can you meet Christ, and how is he meeting you in the midst of that suffering? And this is true not just for gender distress, obviously, but all kinds of suffering. But I think my go-to prayer when I'm experiencing suffering is to ask Christ to make this suffering fruitful. Make this suffering fruitful through his grace, whether that's fruitful in my own life and my own heart, but also sometimes I'll connect it to a particular prayer intention. Like if I know someone, like if my brother's going through a really hard time, like make this suffering fruitful for him. And I think there's also a way in which you can find meaning and union with Christ in the midst of suffering, even as you do kind of walk that road toward integration and reconciliation, with your whole embodied self.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Abigail. I really appreciate your mind and your heart through your embodied self, exhorting us today. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. You asked such great questions. This has been fun.
We just officially say goodbye to Abigail, which I can't wait to hear from you guys about what you thought. But if you guys are interested in reading her book or her new book on her journey back to faith, I'm going to link to that in the bio. As we wrap things up, I want to give one more hello, O'Neill Asset Management. We appreciate you. I know you guys just both snap your head, look at me, and you're like, what's this deep voice? Hello, O'Neill. We're so thankful to them helping us out in our questions about finances. If you guys have questions about finances, reach out to o'neillassetmanagement.com. There is a complimentary analysis of your finances if you do that. Okay, Matt, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
Conversation with Abigail. I've been talking your ear off about her book all summer. What'd you think?
It was very good. I think the place that when you kind of got on your soapbox, and then we talked about like about the genesis of some of this being kind of that taking away procreativity from sexual experience through the use of contraceptives. I can't help but think of how that also affected men with kind of raising sexual entitlement, because you're taking away the quote unquote consequence of sexual activity, and how that maybe has contributed to the rise of pornography, the rise of some of the violent, porn and rape culture and stuff that maybe are also driving, some of what the stats you're seeing in the UK and everything. So I think there's just a deeply embedded kind of ripple effect of some of that we will never fully understand, but that is there.
Steve?
I just really appreciated what she had to say about quick fixes and how as a culture we're after the quick fix for whatever the presenting problem looks like, and having that theology of suffering. I mean, we've heard it before from other guests we've talked with. It just feels like that's the message of this year for me, and it's been very helpful. So that's what I took away from it.
Two things. One is when she was talking about the more liberal movement to turn gender and sex like into like your secondary sex features, so that'd be like not your internal organs, and gender stereotypes. I was like, the hyper-fundamentalist people can do a very similar thing, is all women have to wear this and look like that and do this. And I was like, man, when we strip the meaning of bodies out of the Bible and out of the gospel context, we just end up in really wrong places. And the second thing I was thinking is when she was talking about therapists, she's like, there's good therapists and bad therapists. I remember us going on a walk as I'm reading this book, and I was like, Matt, listen, there's people who are just walking kids to permanent life change. And I was like, be a good therapist, Matt. And you're like, I am. Like, you couldn't convince me enough. Like, I was like, no, you need to spread the word. So maybe that's where we'll land the plane here is be a good therapist. Be someone who is preaching the gospel in all the ways that we can. Question of the week for next time. I want to do this question because Matt's been driving me nuts. Facts on facts. Here's the question I want to do. I just don't think it's going to translate to y'all, so I'll tell you what we're actually going to do. What commercial regularly plays in your head? Matt has like a run of 20 to 30 commercials that he just says, and I can pause after I say something, and I know it's going to trigger Matt, and he's going to say this thing from like 1991, and I'm like, oh my gosh. But I've learned to laugh.
It's not always a commercial. Sometimes it's a movie quote or a song lyric.
Yes.
Or a random screaming Jawa saying poutine.
Don't know where it came from. I hear poutine a lot. It's a Jawa. Jawas say that in which Star Wars?
Episode 4, A New Hope.
All the nerds are
I know
rejoicing.
exactly. I know that exact spot you're talking about. Yep.
Good night. Okay. I just am going to ask this more regular person question. What movie do you quote the most? So we're probably going to get some Anchorman. I've never seen it. I don't know. Little Women, whatever. I want to hear what you guys quote the most.
What do you quote the most?
Maybe Devil Wears Prada.
It was probably between that or Mean Girls. But
someone's ready to go. What do you guys quote the most? I'm going to ask you guys. You can keep cracking me up. Go to the Hold My Heart Podcast Facebook page, answer a couple questions, and we'll let you in. Okay. If you guys like if you like the question or the podcast, would you take a minute to rate and review? Or you can send me an email at podcast@lauriekrieg.com. I read them. I appreciate it. You guys lately have been like, I like when you guys are just goofy and you just go offline in your brain. I'm like, that's what I like. So we're going to try and do more of that in the springtime harvest. Is what pops in my head. Springtime season, back half of the season. Anyway, sorry, Zach, you got so much to edit. Thank you again to Abigail Favale for dealing with our Banana Town world, but then also going so deep, talking about the genesis of gender. Thank you to WCSG for hosting, to the Zach of all trades. We appreciate you for doing everything. And your intern, what's your intern's name? Hunter. We got Hunter now. So we're thankful for him and for all of us here at the Hold My Heart Podcast. We'll see you next time.